Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
Miss Marple and Death Comes in Pairs. Chapter 1. The Fate of Fortune. The autumn sun cast a soft golden veil across the village green of Little Skelton, warming the moss-covered stone walls and gleaming atop the brass knobs of the church gates. The annual harvest fete was in full swing. Children shrieked gleefully near the coconut shy, bunting fluttered playfully in the breeze, and the smell of jam tarts and beeswax polish drifted lazily through the air. Miss Jane Marple, clad in a dove-grey shawl and a pale blue hat trimmed with violets, sat in a wooden chair beside the judging table. Her knitting needles clicked lightly in her lap as she watched a line of ladies present their preserves for the jam competition. "Blackberry with a hint of elderflower," cooed Mrs. Prudence Feltham, laying down her jar with a hopeful smile. "Delightful," murmured Miss Marple, examining the deep plum colour through the glass. "Quite elegantly set, too." "Not always so easy with elderflower, can turn watery." Mrs. Feltham beamed and stepped aside for the next hopeful, while Miss Marple jotted a few notes in tidy cursive. But she wasn't merely judging jam. Miss Marple, as ever, observed the village with the quiet intensity of a sparrow watching a cat. Her pale blue eyes moved gently from stall to stall, registering details: who spoke with whom, whose smiles were forced, and who avoided whose gaze. A sudden hush rippled across the crowd like a chill wind. Mr. Archibald Pomeroy, the officious local land agent with bristling white whiskers and a glossy walking stick, had climbed onto the raffle stage. He cleared his throat dramatically and unrolled a scroll of numbers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "I shall now draw the winner of the harvest hamper." He dipped his gloved hand into a basket, pulled a ticket with theatrical flair, and adjusted his spectacles with exaggerated care. "Number 17, he declared triumphantly. A brief cheer rose up. Miss Gwendoline Park, the spinster piano teacher, squeaked in delight. But her cheer turned quickly to alarm. "Good heavens! Mr. Pomeroy!" Archibald Pomeroy staggered slightly, his face ashen. His hand clutched the handle of his cane, then twitched upward unnaturally. A glassy sheen coated his eyes. With a groan barely louder than the rustle of leaves, he crumpled to the grass in a most unceremonious heap. There was a stunned silence, then a chorus of gasps. Miss Marple, rising carefully to her feet, threaded her way through the gathering crowd. She reached him just as Dr. Elspeth Brathwaite elbowed her way forward, stethoscope already in hand. "Well," murmured Miss Marple, her voice mild but steady. Dr. Brathwaite examined the body briskly, brow furrowed. "Pulse gone. Rigid jaw. Dead within moments, I'd say. Heart failure, very likely. Poor devil." Miss Marple's gaze dropped to the cane still gripped in Pomeroy's left hand. Odd, she thought. He was most certainly right-hand. She'd seen him sign checks and flick ash with that hand only last week. She said nothing. A low murmuring had begun amongst the villagers. Shocking. Well, he did have a temper. I saw him arguing with Colonel Fortescue only yesterday. Beatrice Linton fainted, you know. Took her straight to the vestry. The fate, though still half-heartedly alive, had lost its sparkle. Stalls were packed away quickly, and the bunting looked suddenly limp, like wet washing left too long on the line. Miss Marple made her way to the refreshment tent, where Mrs. Millicent Graves, the village postmistress, was fussing with tea cups. "Dear me, Jane," she whispered, handing over a china cup. The way he dropped, like a sack of flour. "Don't you think it was frightfully convenient?" "Convenient?" Miss Marple echoed gently. "Well," Millicent lowered her voice further, "I heard he'd just changed his will last week. Cut out his nephew entirely. Left everything to a charitable fund he hadn't yet named." "How curious," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea slowly. "How very sudden, and rather unlike Mr. Pomeroy." Just then, Colonel Reginald Fortescue stomped into the tent, his moustache twitching furiously. "Whole thing's a blasted mess," he muttered. "That man was a pompous fraud, but I never wished him dead. And now we'll have police poking around, no doubt." Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind was ticking quietly behind her eyes. Pomeroy had many enemies, that much was common knowledge. He was the sort of man who enjoyed small cruelties, raising rents, denying permissions, holding grudges as if they were family heirlooms. Across the tent, Mrs. Beatrice Linton, the quiet widow who kept mostly to herself, sat pale and trembling beside a cup of untouched tea. Her gloved hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white. Miss Marple noticed how she flinched when someone mentioned the word autopsy. "Interesting." The vicar announced that the fête would conclude early out of respect and decency. Crowds dispersed quietly, as if carrying something heavy and invisible. Back at her small cottage in St. Mary Mead that evening, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of hot milk and sat beside the fire, her knitting untouched for once. She stared thoughtfully into the flames. Mr. Archibald Pomeroy had died suddenly in public, and everyone assumed it was natural. But Miss Marple didn't believe in neat deaths. Not when walking sticks appeared in the wrong hands and widows trembled too much for mere shock. She suspected, though she could not yet prove, that death had not come to Mr. Pomeroy by misfortune. It had come by invitation. Chapter 2: A Whisper of Regret. The following morning brought an odd stillness to Little Skelton. Even the crows in the churchyard seemed quieter, and the milkman, normally a cheerful whistler, did his rounds in respectful silence. The unexpected death of Mr. Archibald Pomeroy hung over the village like low-hanging fog, unspoken yet heavy. Miss Marple, seated neatly at her breakfast table with a boiled egg and slice of marmalade toast, read the notice in the Little Skelton Gazette. Prominent land agent collapses at fête, doctor attributes cause to heart failure. She set the paper aside and sipped her tea. It was all very tidy, very contained. And yet, she could not help feeling that something remained out of key. Like a piano note slightly flat. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in, dear," she called gently. Miss Gwendoline Park stepped in, flushed and flustered, holding a bouquet of late autumn asters. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple. I brought these for your windowsill." "Not at all." "How kind," said Miss Marple, rising to accept them. "You must sit and rest a moment." Gwendoline sat, smoothing her skirt. "It's all anyone talks about, of course. Poor Mr. Pomeroy. Dropping like that, so sudden." "Yes," Miss Marple said lightly, "rather theatrical, wasn't it? Right at the moment of announcing the winner." Gwendoline nodded gravely. Mrs. Graves said she saw Beatrice Linton crying in the vestry after it happened. She looked dreadfully shaken. Of course, they'd had dealings. Had they? Miss Marple tilted her head. "Well," Gwendoline leaned in, lowering her voice instinctively. "Last year, Mr. Pomeroy tried to raise her cottage rent by an absurd amount. Claimed it needed adjusting to market values. She couldn't afford it, naturally, and begged him to reconsider. He refused. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the vase as she placed the flowers inside. And then what happened? Oh, he dropped the increase suddenly. No explanation. Just told her it was no longer under review. She told me herself it didn't sit right. Like he'd changed his mind for some private reason. Miss Marple turned slowly, her face calm. Curious. Most unlike Mr. Pomeroy to retreat once he sniffed blood. Gwendoline hesitated. Do you think it wasn't natural? His death? Miss Marple smiled gently. I think it was sudden. But that's not quite the same thing. After Gwendoline departed, Miss Marple took her hat and umbrella and made her way toward the high street. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and chimney smoke. Her path led her past the post office, where Mrs. Millicent Graves stood on a stool, readying a crooked sign advertising toffee tins. Ah, Miss Marple, she called down. Do you know, I've never had so many people mailing condolences to someone they barely tolerated. Miss Marple smiled. Human nature, Millicent. We dislike scandal more than we dislike the deceased. Mrs. Graves chuckled. Truth in that, I'd say. Oh, and speaking of truth, Mrs. Linton's been in and out all morning. Sent 3 letters before 10 o'clock. Shaking like a leaf. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Really? She asked for foreign stamps too. 1 letter to Yorkshire, 1 to Devon, and 1, if you please, to Paris. All hand-addressed in shaky cursive. Rather a long list of correspondence for a woman who rarely leaves her garden. That's what I thought. Miss Marple thanked her and continued on, taking the path that curved behind the churchyard and led up toward the Linton cottage, a modest little place with a white gate and overgrown ivy. The gate was ajar. She was about to knock when she heard voices, low, urgent, barely restrained. I told you, said a male voice, gravelly and irritated. You should have said something earlier. I couldn't, whispered another, Beatrice's voice, unmistakably. He threatened me, Reginald. He said he'd ruin me. You didn't know what he had. You think I care? I'd have dealt with him. But now look what's happened. Miss Marple blinked. Reginald? Colonel Fortescue? That was rather more familiar than expected. There was a silence, then Beatrice murmured, You don't think it was natural, do you? I think, came the low response, You'd better hope to God it was. Miss Marple turned and retraced her steps, her mind sharper than the autumn wind curling round her ankles. That small exchange confirmed more than she'd hoped. Not only had Mr. Pomeroy been blackmailing Beatrice, he had also pushed her to the edge of desperation. And Colonel Fortescue knew far more than he let on. That afternoon, the coroner's preliminary report arrived. Dr. Brathwaite's findings listed acute cardiac failure as the official cause of death, but added a footnote. Further analysis recommended due to abnormal cyanosis in lips and fingertips. A trace of blue. Poison? Miss Marple spent the evening reviewing her diary. Names, connections, behaviours. She remembered that Mr. Pomeroy had not attended the tea tent before his collapse. But someone could have slipped something into his flask. He always carried one, silver and dented, boasting of it as of an old regimental souvenir. She would have to speak to Alfred Penrose. The young church organist, though awkward and shy, had helped serve the raffle drinks and had a clear view of the refreshments table. When she arrived at the church vestry the next day, Alfred was tuning the organ with a pair of thick glasses perched halfway down his nose. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said nervously. "Didn't expect, visitors." "I wondered if you might recall," she said cheerfully, "who poured Mr. Pomeroy's drink before the raffle." He rubbed his chin. "Well, not me. I was refilling the lemonade bowl. But I saw Beatrice Linton pass him his flask. He said something about having left it on the bench. She picked it up." Miss Marple gave a pleasant little nod. "Thank you, Mr. Penrose. That's most helpful." As she stepped out into the churchyard once more, she paused beside the stone angel that overlooked the path. Something was emerging through the fog now, faint but visible. A pattern of pressure, secrets, and fear. Pomeroy's death had been no accident. Miss Marple was certain now. And someone in Little Skelton, someone fearful, quiet, and terribly cornered, had taken fate into their own trembling hands. Chapter 3: A Second Shock. 3 days had passed since the harvest fete, yet the pall over Little Skelton had only thickened. Mr. Archibald Pomeroy's funeral was scheduled for Friday, but the whispers had not waited for the burial. The village, already fond of speculation, now turned its curiosity into an art form. Inside the Pickled Pheasant, the local inn, murmured theory swirled like steam from teacups. The cause of death was still listed as heart failure, but Dr. Brathwaite's vague note about abnormal cyanosis had fueled a quiet storm. Miss Marple, having made her usual morning calls, returned home just before noon and was removing her gloves when a sharp knock sounded at her door. It was Mrs. Millicent Graves, cheeks flushed with urgency. "Jane," she said breathlessly, "it's happened again." Miss Marple blinked. "What has?" "Miss Weatherby. Eugenia Weatherby. Found dead this morning in her conservatory. The vicar's wife discovered her." Miss Marple stood still for a moment, then gently ushered Millicent in and set the kettle to boil. "Tell me everything," she said, voice calm but steady. Mrs. Graves needed no prompting. Apparently, the vicar's wife was bringing over some quinces, as she often does. Found Eugenia slumped over her writing desk. The French doors were ajar, and the cord from the garden blinds was wrapped, well, around her throat. She shuddered. "Strangled, Jane?" "In broad daylight." Miss Marple nodded once, slowly. "Then it wasn't sudden illness that befell poor Mr. Pomeroy?" "No, it was murder," Mrs. Graves whispered. And now again. The police, now thoroughly alarmed, had arrived from Market Chipping within the hour. Inspector Harold Raxby, a tall, ruddy-faced man with an overconfident gait, took charge. Though he nodded politely to Miss Marple, it was clear he regarded her more as decoration than assistance. Eugenia Weatherby's conservatory was a small, well-kept room attached to the rear of her cottage. Glass panels arched overhead, casting dappled light onto rows of potted geraniums and African violets. A desk stood at one end, tidy save for a tipped-over teacup and a half-written letter on thick cream stationery. Inspector Raxby crouched beside the body and frowned. "Tea still warm," he muttered. No sign of a break-in. No weapon, aside from the cord itself. Robbery doesn't appear to be the motive. Miss Marple stood quietly in the doorway, her gloved hands folded neatly. She noted the scene with care, the smudge on the floor where a shoe had scuffed the tile, the way the chair was slightly askew, and how the French doors, though open, had no signs of forced entry. She turned to Eugenia's maid, a pale girl named Ruthie, who wrung her hands nervously. "Did Miss Weatherby expect any visitors this morning?" Miss Marple asked gently. Ruthie shook her head. "No, She said she'd be writing letters. She liked her quiet. Didn't even want tea until just after 11. Miss Marple glanced at the clock above the fireplace. It read 20 past 11. Was this door usually kept locked? She asked, gesturing to the garden entrance. No, Miss Weatherby liked fresh air. She always opened it in the mornings. Miss Marple nodded again. So, anyone familiar with her habits could have walked in without difficulty. She drifted to the desk and studied the letter. The handwriting, neat and purposeful, trailed off mid-word. The final line read, "I have reason to believe the same person who harmed Mr. Pomeroy may now be turning." And nothing more. The pen had been set aside, not dropped. She was interrupted. Not startled. Not struggling, yet. There was a faint fingerprint on the edge of the paper, just at the lower left corner. Miss Marple said nothing, but she stored it away carefully in her mind. Outside the cottage, Inspector Raxby held an impromptu meeting with the primary villagers who knew Miss Weatherby. Miss Marple observed from a nearby bench. "Did Miss Weatherby mention receiving threats?" he asked. A few murmured no. But Colonel Fortescue, arms stiff at his sides, offered a grunt. Pomeroy and she were thick as thieves, once. Then they had a falling out. She'd said something about knowing too much. You know the sort, dramatic woman. Sharp as a tack. Not always discreet. Beside him, Mrs. Beatrice Linton looked pale, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. She said nothing, but her eyes were glassy with either grief or fear. Miss Marple couldn't yet tell which. The inspector turned next to Alfred Penrose, the organist, who stood nervously clutching his hat. "Miss Weatherby once scolded me for playing too loud," he said, blinking. "I didn't know her well." "Any enemies?" Raxby asked. "Only those with secrets," murmured Miss Marple, almost too softly to hear. That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, a notebook open on her lap. She reviewed what she had. Archibald Pomeroy, blackmailer, dead at the fête. Appeared to be poisoned. Eugenia Weatherby, sharp-witted, also dead, strangled in her own conservatory. Both deaths within days. Both victims known to be in possession of something, secrets or leverage. Beatrice Linton had delivered Pomeroy's flask. Miss Weatherby was writing a letter naming someone. The killer had interrupted her. And now two were dead. Miss Marple rose and walked to her bureau, pulling out a small black book filled with names and sketches of character. Not criminal records, no. Merely types of people she had encountered over the years. She flipped to the section marked Desperate Widows. Poison often suits the quiet ones, she murmured. Strangulation is messier. Riskier. A sign of panic or escalation. She paused and thought of the conversation she'd overheard between Beatrice and Colonel Fortescue. Reginald had sounded angry, but also protective. Beatrice had clearly feared Pomeroy. Could she also have feared Eugenia? Or had someone else feared both of them? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the old photograph she'd seen months ago in Miss Weatherby's drawing room, a group picture from a wartime charity gathering. She remembered a smiling Beatrice, standing beside a man in uniform, not her husband, but someone else. That photo had been missing when she visited Eugenia's house earlier. Removed. Hidden. Someone was trying very hard to erase connections. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the scene under the pretense of delivering a sympathy basket of scones. She wandered briefly into the garden, pretending to admire the chrysanthemums, until her eye caught something in the flowerbed beneath the open French doors. Pressed into the soft earth, barely visible, was the faint imprint of a woman's shoe, a sensible heel, narrow, small. And beside it, distinct but muddied, was the tip of a walking stick. Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression unreadable. Someone had returned to the scene of the crime. And someone was slipping. The killer had silenced one voice. But Miss Marple had already begun to hear the echoes. Chapter 4: An Old Photograph. The funeral of Miss Eugenia Weatherby was a quiet affair, as dignified as the lady herself had always insisted upon in life. The village turned out in respectful silence. Black hats bobbed gently in the breeze, and handkerchiefs fluttered like pale moths among the mourners. The vicar spoke kindly, though he had never quite known what to make of Miss Weatherby. Sharp-witted women, he often confessed, made him rather nervous. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the gathering, her expression serene but inwardly alert. She watched who came, who lingered, and most tellingly, who did not. Colonel Fortescue, stiff-backed and solemn, offered a curt nod as he passed. Beside him, Mrs. Beatrice Linton clutched a crumpled handkerchief, her eyes red-rimmed, her shoulders drawn inward like a closing shell. Miss Marple noticed the way Beatrice glanced toward the churchyard gate, twice. Waiting for someone? When the final hymn faded and the mourners dispersed, Miss Marple did not return home at once. Instead, she made her way to the late Miss Weatherby's cottage. She had, earlier that morning, obtained quiet permission from Inspector Raxby to collect a few personal items Eugenia had promised to a mutual friend. The inspector, still convinced the crime was personal and impulsive, had waved her off with distracted approval. The house stood still under the grey sky, its lace curtains drawn and front path lined with fallen leaves. Miss Marple let herself in gently and paused in the parlour. It was a neat, cold room, everything precisely where it belonged, as if the space itself resisted disturbance. On the mantel, silver-framed portraits stood in symmetrical pairs. But one was conspicuously missing. There had once been, Miss Marple recalled, a group photograph, a gathering from 1942, taken during the war years. It had always caught her eye on previous visits. The photo had featured a much younger Eugenia Weatherby, smiling modestly among a crowd of women and uniformed men. And beside her, hand resting lightly on her shoulder, had stood a tall, striking man, Captain Lionel Linton, if memory served. He was not Beatrice's husband, no. Her late husband had been a quiet fellow in clerical work, not at all the dashing military sort. But Captain Linton had been from the same village. The same bloodline, perhaps? Why, Miss Marple wondered, had that photograph been removed now? She opened the small sideboard beside the fireplace. Inside were scrapbooks, ration books, a silver pencil case, and, tucked between 2 volumes of local church history, the photograph, unframed and folded, as though meant to be hidden but not destroyed. Carefully, she unfolded it. The faces stared back, 10 or 12 villagers, gathered in front of the women's volunteer canteen. Young, earnest, smiling through fatigue. She studied them closely. There was Eugenia, eyes alert and thoughtful. And beside her, Captain Linton, chin lifted, hand resting gently but firmly on her shoulder. And next to them, half hidden, stood a woman with neatly styled hair and an unmistakable shy expression, Beatrice. Miss Marple tapped her finger against the paper thoughtfully. A love triangle? Perhaps. Or something murkier, jealousy, betrayal, unspoken resentments. Wartime, after all, bred strange intimacies and stranger secrets. She refolded the photograph and slid it into her handbag. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Prudence Feltham, the village's chief repository of recollection, rumour, and recipe. If anyone remembered the wartime years in Little Skelton clearly and would not object to a bit of tea and polite probing, it was Prudence. "Oh yes, dear," Prudence said, slicing a treacle cake with theatrical precision. I remember that photo. Captain Linton was quite the charmer, wasn't he? Broke a fair few hearts. Especially young Beatrice's. Was she in love with him? Oh, head over heels. Everyone could see it, except him, perhaps. But he was always sniffing about Eugenia. She pretended not to notice, but I dare say she was flattered. Were Beatrice and Eugenia friends? Of a sort. Friendly enough to smile at garden parties, but not quite bosom companions. I think Beatrice always felt second best around Eugenia. She had a way, you know, Eugenia did, of making people feel as though they'd misplaced their grammar or missed the point entirely. Miss Marple smiled. And what happened to Captain Linton? Posted abroad, Prudence said, pouring tea. Then reported missing. Never came back. I don't think his body was ever recovered. Tragic, murmured Miss Marple. And did Beatrice marry soon after? Prudence nodded. Rather quickly. A quiet fellow, worked with railway ledgers. Died a few years later. Beatrice kept to herself mostly after that. Miss Marple sipped her tea, absorbing the story like a sponge soaking up secrets. The past, she had always said, never really stays buried, not in villages like this. It simply waits until the right, or wrong, moment to reappear. The following morning, Inspector Raxby summoned Miss Marple to the station. "We've taken your advice seriously," he said, though with a trace of reluctance. "We've begun examining the photograph you mentioned. Found it tucked away in a book in Miss Weatherby's cottage. And we've compared the fingerprints on the letter she was writing." "Were there any matches?" Miss Marple asked, folding her hands politely. "One partial. On the left edge of the paper. Matched Mrs. Linton's prints from a previous license application." "You think that's significant?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said mildly. "Did she ever mention why she visited Miss Weatherby on the morning of the murder?" "Claims she never went. Said she was at home baking and spoke to no one. But one of the village boys saw her walking past the post office not 10 minutes before the estimated time of death. So, she lied." "Looks that way." Miss Marple rose from her chair, taking her time. "If I may suggest, Inspector, keep an eye on who visits the churchyard in the evening. Grief can make the guilty sentimental." That evening, as twilight softened the outlines of tombstones and cast long shadows between the trees, Miss Marple stood quietly behind the church lych gate. She watched the figure approach, slowly, deliberately. Mrs. Beatrice Linton, in her navy wool coat, stepped across the gravel path, a single white lily in her hand. She paused before Miss Weatherby's freshly turned grave. Not long. Just long enough to murmur something, place the flower, and press her hand against the cool stone. Then she turned and walked away. Not hurried, not weeping. Calm. Controlled. Miss Marple stepped out of the shadows. "You were fond of her, then?" Beatrice stopped. Her mouth opened, then shut. "She knew something about me," she said quietly. "Something I couldn't afford to let out." "Did you kill her to keep it hidden?" "No," Beatrice whispered. "But I fear someone did. And if they think I might speak next?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then you must be very careful, Mrs. Linton. Secrets are often more dangerous when shared by two." The truth, Miss Marple thought as she walked home, was circling now, visible only in fragments, but forming shape. The photograph, the past, the whispered regrets, it all pointed in one direction. 2 murders had already been committed. And she suspected the killer wasn't finished yet. Chapter 5. The Garden That Lied. The morning after her moonlit encounter with Beatrice Linton, Miss Marple awoke with a peculiar sense of certainty. She couldn't name it yet, what the truth was or where it pointed, but it hovered near, like the scent of lavender before you see the plant. There was something she had overlooked. Not a word, not a lie, but a place. Gardens, she thought, are rarely as innocent as they appear. After a light breakfast and a brief call to confirm that Dr. Brathwaite would be at the surgery all morning, Miss Marple slipped on her softest walking shoes and made her way to Eugenia Weatherby's cottage. The constable on duty at the gate gave her a respectful nod. "You again, Miss Marple?" "Yes," she replied sweetly. "Inspector Raxby gave me permission to check the rear garden again. It's the roses, you know. Miss Weatherby always claimed they bloom twice when well spoken to." The constable chuckled and waved her through. The path was overgrown since the murder. No one had dared touch the place. Fallen petals lay like silent witnesses across the flagstones. Miss Marple moved slowly, letting her eyes adjust to the mild sunlight peeking through the trellis. She paused outside the conservatory's French doors, where Eugenia had been found. The soil just beneath the threshold had been disturbed, no doubt during the police examination. But to the right, under the camellia bush, the ground was less obvious. And yet, she knelt. There, barely visible beneath the dead leaves, was the edge of a broken terracotta pot, shattered unevenly. And inside it, tucked with odd deliberation, was something pale and crumpled. Miss Marple reached in and drew it out, a delicate white cotton glove, stained at the fingertips. She turned it over. The thumb and first two fingers bore traces of dried soil and something else. Something dark. Blood? Perhaps. Or ink. It would need checking. But what truly struck her was the size. Small. Slim. Feminine. She rose slowly, brushing her knees. No garden gloves were missing from Eugenia's shed, Miss Marple recalled. She had checked earlier, which meant this had been brought from elsewhere by someone who had entered through the garden and left hurriedly, forgetting what they'd worn. The garden, she thought grimly, does not lie. Even when people do. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a polite visit to Tommy Briggs, the village gardener. He had been tending to the vicarage roses since before the war and knew every patch of soil in Little Skelton by instinct. "Morning, miss," he said, tipping his cap as she appeared. "Come to inspect my compost." "Nothing so dreadful," she smiled. "I wondered if you ever worked in Miss Weatherby's garden." "Oh, sure. Not regularly, but she'd call me in when something needed digging proper. Didn't trust Ruthie with a spade." "Did she have many visitors through the garden entrance?" Tommy scratched his head. "Not often. Mostly Ruthie brought things in that way. Once or twice I saw Mrs. Linton come through. Never stayed long, though. Always looked tense, she did. Tight around the mouth." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you ever see anyone else lurking about?" "Not really. Though," he paused. "Come to think of it, I saw young Mr. Penrose walk past her hedge one morning. Looked like he was about to knock, then turned back sharpish." "Did he see you?" "Didn't seem to. Looked preoccupied." Miss Marple thanked him and strolled back through the village, her mind turning over what she'd heard. Penrose? The timid organist? Unlikely. And yet, the murder was becoming less about strength and more about timing. Who knew Eugenia would be writing a letter? Who had the opportunity to silence her? She stopped at the post office on her way home, greeted by Mrs. Graves' usual rustle of brown paper and ink-stained fingers. "Any news from market chipping?" Miss Marple asked, selecting a card from the rack. "They're still waiting on lab results from the glove," Mrs. Graves whispered. "Inspector Raxby's in a proper stew about it. I imagine he is. Murder tends to shake tidy nerves." Speaking of nerves, Mrs. Graves leaned in conspiratorially. "Did you know Beatrice Linton withdrew a large sum from her savings 2 days before Pomeroy died? Enough to buy a small car, they say." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "She has no motor car, does she?" "Not that I've seen. And she paid Ruthie an extra week's wages yesterday for no reason at all. Guilt, I say. Or fear." Miss Marple agreed with a nod, though inwardly she filed the information in a different category entirely. That afternoon, she paid a call to Beatrice. The widow answered the door herself, wearing a soft mauve cardigan and an air of practiced calm. "Miss Marple," she said with a brittle smile. "Have you come to ask more questions?" "No, dear," Miss Marple replied. "Just a little neighborly call. One can't help wondering how everyone's managing with so much unpleasantness." Beatrice hesitated, then stepped aside. "Please, come in." They sat in the parlor, sipping tea from thin porcelain cups. A fire smoldered gently in the grate, but Beatrice's hands trembled slightly as she poured the milk. "You and Miss Weatherby," Miss Marple said gently, "had known each other for many years." "Yes," Beatrice whispered. "We were never very close. I envied her, I suppose. That cleverness of hers. The way she seemed to see through everything." Miss Marple sipped. "And yet, she was fond of you." Beatrice blinked. "Was she?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said softly. "She once told me that she regretted what had happened in 1942. She never said more, of course. But I believe she hoped to mend things." Beatrice looked down at her lap. "Some things cannot be mended." "No," Miss Marple agreed, setting down her cup. "But some truths can be forgiven if they're shared in time." Beatrice looked up sharply. Her eyes were wide, full of something deeper than fear. "You think I killed her?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "you were being blackmailed. By Pomeroy, and perhaps others. And that your past, whatever it held, was suddenly no longer safe." Beatrice didn't deny it. She sat very still. Then she whispered, "I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. But I know who did." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Then you must tell someone. Before they kill again." Beatrice said nothing. But her face, drained of color, told Miss Marple all she needed to know. Back home that evening, Miss Marple examined the glove once more. Left hand. Small. Faint traces of camellia pollen. The glove had been discarded hastily, but the person who wore it had been calm enough to fold the photograph, to remove fingerprints from the French door handle, to take away the unfinished letter. It was someone clever. Someone patient. Not afraid to kill once, and not afraid to do it again. The garden had spoken. Now, Miss Marple needed only to make others listen. Chapter 6: Tea and Testimony. It was a cool Saturday afternoon when Miss Marple invited four of Little Skelton's most watchful residents to tea at her cottage on Church Lane. The sun hovered low above the thatched rooftops, casting long golden lines across the parlor floor. Everything had been prepared with care: polished china, 3 kinds of jam, and a Victoria sponge that had been sliced so evenly one might suspect a ruler had been involved. The parlor fire crackled gently, filling the room with a toasty warmth. The guests arrived promptly at 4. Colonel Reginald Fortescue, upright and starched as always, nodded his greeting and took the far chair by the hearth. Mrs. Beatrice Linton, dressed in dark green and pale-faced, sat close to the tea table, fingers curled nervously around her handbag. Mr. Alfred Penrose, the organist, fidgeted as he perched on the ottoman. And finally, Mrs. Prudence Feltham, who had not been invited as a suspect, but as a steady stream of conversation to lubricate the awkward silences. Miss Marple, as ever, moved slowly but observantly, offering refills, buttering scones, and steering the conversation with the gentle authority of a seasoned conductor. "We do seem to have had rather a run of unpleasantness lately," she said mildly, stirring her tea. "2 funerals in 1 week," Prudence sighed. "Not since the influenza winter of '36. Colonel Fortescue grunted. "Unnatural, if you ask me. That Pomeroy fellow had enemies. But Eugenia, whatever her flaws, didn't deserve that end." Miss Marple nodded. "No, she didn't. And perhaps what makes it so disturbing is how deliberate it all seems. A method behind the madness." Beatrice's cup clinked softly in its saucer. She didn't speak. Alfred, however, offered a small, anxious cough. I don't mean to overstep, but perhaps it's all coincidence. A heart attack, then a burglar, perhaps Miss Weatherby disturbed them." "Unlikely," Miss Marple replied gently. She hadn't disturbed anything. In fact, she was quite focused, writing a letter. A letter she didn't finish. And someone made sure she wouldn't. The room fell quiet. Colonel Fortescue shifted in his chair. "You're suggesting one of us did it?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, spooning raspberry jam with slow precision, "that someone in this room knows more than they have said. And that perhaps someone else knew too much." Prudence sat forward, lips pursed. "You think it was about the war, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You see, Prudence, memory in a village is rather like ivy, it clings. During the war, many things happened that we were told to forget. But people remember. And people who remember are sometimes dangerous." She turned slightly. "Beatrice, may I ask, did you love Captain Lionel Linton?" Beatrice paled. I was very young. It was a long time ago." "But you did," Miss Marple continued gently. "He was engaged to Eugenia Weatherby, wasn't he? Or very nearly?" "Yes," Beatrice whispered. "They exchanged letters. He never made it back from Africa. Killed in a raid. Eugenia was never quite the same." "And you were left with nothing," Miss Marple said. "But you never blamed her?" "Not truly." Beatrice looked down. Her voice was quiet, almost childlike. "I hated her sometimes. But I pitied her more." Colonel Fortescue looked uncomfortable. "What has that got to do with murder?" "Everything," Miss Marple said softly. "Because someone else knew about it. Knew about the past. About Captain Linton's final letter and where it had ended up." Everyone stared. "There was a letter," Miss Marple continued, "that Captain Linton sent shortly before he died. It never reached Eugenia. It was intercepted. Hidden. Until recently." "How do you know this?" Alfred asked, wide-eyed. "I found a photograph in Eugenia's house. Behind it, in the frame, was a folded note. The missing letter. Faded but intact." Colonel Fortescue stiffened. "And what did it say?" It declared Lionel's intent to break off the engagement. He had fallen for someone else. He didn't name her, but he wrote of her gentle soul and quiet eyes like sea glass. Miss Marple turned her gaze directly to Alfred Penrose. "I believe you read that letter too, Mr. Penrose." He blinked. I beg your pardon. You were seen walking past Eugenia's cottage the day before her death. You didn't knock. But you saw the garden door ajar, didn't you? You went in, hoping to talk or to steal something you feared might surface. That's not true. But you found the photograph instead. And behind it, the letter. You read it and realized what it meant. Beatrice was the woman Captain Linton loved. Not Eugenia. Alfred swallowed hard. I didn't hurt her. I don't think you did, Miss Marple said kindly. But I believe you told someone. Someone who stood to lose far more. She turned at last to Beatrice. You paid Ruthie early. You withdrew money. You were preparing to run. Beatrice said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward. You didn't kill Pomeroy either, did you? Beatrice slowly shook her head. No. But he threatened me. He said he had proof of the things. He never said what. But he smiled like he held a match near a fuse. Miss Marple took a breath. Then the question remains, who killed Pomeroy and Eugenia to silence the past? A silence settled. Then, softly, Beatrice whispered, I think it was Reginald. Everyone turned to the Colonel. I told him, she said. About the letter. About Pomeroy's threats. He promised he'd fix everything. And then the deaths began. Colonel Fortescue stood slowly, eyes blazing. That's absurd. I protected her. That's all. Miss Marple watched him with the quiet patience of a woman who had solved more murders than most detectives dared admit. You were in love with Beatrice, she said gently. Always were. You saw your chance to shield her and removed anyone who could shame her. Or take her away. He looked down at his hands. Eugenia wouldn't have kept silent. Not one she knew. And Pomeroy, he deserved worse. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That may be so. But murder, Colonel, is rarely justifiable. And always traceable. He turned toward the door, but the constable had arrived. Miss Marple had already sent for him before tea had begun. As Colonel Fortescue was quietly escorted out, Beatrice sat in stunned silence. Miss Marple offered her a fresh cup of tea. It seems, she said softly, that love is quite capable of becoming lethal when paired with guilt. Chapter 7. The mirror was moved. It was a quiet morning when Miss Marple walked once more to Lavender House, the late Archibald Pomeroy's cottage. The village was still reeling from Colonel Fortescue's arrest the day before, his sudden downfall as unsettling as the crimes he now stood accused of. And yet, something still troubled her. Miss Marple, for all her careful deductions and steady intuition, had learned never to rest content with a single confession. Not when details still misaligned. And one such detail, it had sat like a splinter in her mind since the fête. The mirror. Not the grand one above the fireplace, but a modest bevel-edged oval that had once hung just inside the entrance hall, opposite the front door. She had noticed it briefly when she first entered the cottage after Pomeroy's death. And then, when she returned later to collect her scarf, it had been higher. Just slightly. But enough for a woman with a memory as keen as Miss Marple's to sense the shift. She arrived at the cottage mid-morning, greeted by a subdued constable and the scent of dust and polish. Inspector Raxby, who had been reviewing paperwork inside, looked up with an expression of half respect, half weariness. "You again, Miss Marple." "I never truly left, Inspector," she said with a smile. "Might I have another look at the hallway? There's something that's been troubling me." Raxby shrugged. "Be my guest." Miss Marple entered the house and stood in the hallway. The mirror was still where she'd last seen it, now quite high, almost level with the top of the door frame. It was an odd placement for a man of Pomeroy's height. He'd have had to lift his chin uncomfortably to check his reflection. And yet, on the day of the fête, it had been lower. She turned to Raxby, who leaned in the doorway. "Inspector, would you mind terribly if I asked for a ladder?" He blinked, then nodded slowly. "All right. But if you fall, it's on you." Within minutes, a stepladder was fetched, and Miss Marple, careful and determined, climbed 3 steps and peered behind the mirror. Her gloved fingers explored the back panel. There it was. A tiny smudge of what looked like powdered residue. Pale grey. Almost invisible. She rubbed it lightly between her fingertips. "Dust from chalk," she murmured. "Schoolroom chalk. Or plasterboard." She stepped down and dusted her hands. "Inspector, do you know who moved this mirror?" Raxby shook his head. "No one's mentioned it. We assumed it hadn't been touched." "Ah, but someone did," she said. "And not simply to adjust the decor. They moved it for a purpose." She looked around the hallway. "Tell me, Inspector, if you stood here, just here, when the mirror was lower, what would you see reflected in it?" Raxby followed her gaze, stepping into place. "The sitting room," he said. "Just inside the door." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "And on the day of the fête, that door was ajar. And inside, on the desk, was Mr. Pomeroy's silver flask." Raxby frowned. So the killer needed to see whether the flask had been touched. Precisely. The mirror served as a spyglass of sorts. Someone clever, moved it upward afterward to conceal the trick. But the smudge of chalk left behind, that betrayed them. Raxby nodded slowly, eyes narrowing. "That's a clever angle, Miss Marple. But who would think to do that?" Miss Marple gave a faint, sad smile. "Someone who values preparation. Someone who works with visual symmetry, placement, order, perspective. Someone trained to focus on angles." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Alfred Penrose in the church hall. He was tuning the organ, as usual, his face set in a mask of concentration. He looked up as she entered. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not in trouble again." "Not at all, dear boy," she said kindly. "I just wondered, how long have you been restoring that painting above the altar?" Alfred blinked. "Oh. Only recently. Since the spring." "Why?" "It's quite fine work. Requires a steady hand and a good eye for symmetry, I imagine." He nodded. "Yes, you have to be precise. Restoration's all about restoring balance. Not just color, but shape, flow, the original intent." "And perspective?" she asked softly. "Very much so." Miss Marple looked at him, her expression calm. "You moved Mr. Pomeroy's mirror to check your placement, didn't you? To see, from the hallway, whether the flask had been tampered with." Alfred's face drained of color. I didn't mean to. He was a terrible man." "Then you poisoned him," she said, voice still gentle. Alfred's shoulders slumped. "He was going to expose me," he whispered. He found out about my dismissal from the art college. They said I forged a donor signature. I didn't. Well, I did, but only to cover a shortfall. I meant to replace it. He blackmailed you, Miss Marple said. Threatened to reveal it unless you helped him with something else. Alfred nodded miserably. He wanted me to spy. Said if I didn't, he'd ruin my reputation completely. He was watching Beatrice, digging into her past. He thought she had hidden money. He was cruel, Miss Marple. Vindictive. And Miss Weatherby, she asked softly. Alfred's face twisted. She found out. She confronted me. Said I had to confess. Said she'd tell the police if I didn't. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to frighten her. Make her stop. But she screamed. I panicked. He looked down at his hands. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I was just scared. Miss Marple nodded gently. I believe you were. But fear, she said, does not wash away guilt. It only deepens it. That evening, as the church bells rang softly through the village, Inspector Raxby arrested Alfred Penrose in the vestry. The constable found the missing flask, half filled with remnants of digitalis, a foxglove-based poison common in village gardens, difficult to trace in small doses. The case was closed. And yet, as Miss Marple sat that night beside her fire, her knitting in hand and kettle quietly humming on the hob, she did not feel triumph. Only a gentle sadness. 2 people had died. 2 others would carry scars for years to come. But the truth, at last, had been restored. Like a crooked mirror quietly returned to its rightful place. Chapter 8, Miss Marple's Summation. The following Tuesday, the drawing room of the vicarage played host to a most unusual gathering. Miss Marple, seated serenely with her embroidery folded neatly in her lap, had requested the presence of several key villagers for the little closing of matters. It was not a demand, merely a suggestion, but in Little Skelton, a suggestion from Miss Marple carried more weight than most police warrants. The vicar and his wife, always generous with tea and discretion, had prepared a modest table with currant cake, ginger biscuits, and a pot of strong Darjeeling. The guests were less relaxed. Mrs. Beatrice Linton sat stiffly by the fire, pale but composed, her gloved hands clenched around a handkerchief. Inspector Harold Raxby leaned against the mantel with his arms folded, his brow still furrowed. Alfred Penrose, under gentle police watch, sat with his eyes on the floor. Prudence Feltham had been invited for balance, and to ensure the rest of the village heard what transpired within the hour. Miss Marple began, not with accusation, but with kindness. It is never pleasant, bringing such a story to its end. Especially when it has cost 2 lives and damaged several others. But we must, I think, understand the full pattern, or it will haunt us all. Raxby gave a small grunt. We have a confession. Surely that's sufficient. Oh, quite, Miss Marple replied with a smile. But not complete. She folded her hands gently. You see, Inspector, Alfred Penrose did indeed cause the deaths of both Mr. Archibald Pomeroy and Miss Eugenia Weatherby, but the path to those acts was paved not with malice, but with fear. And fear, as you know, does not emerge in a vacuum. Alfred flinched, but said nothing. Miss Marple turned to the others. Let me begin at the start. Mr. Pomeroy, as we all know, was not a man of natural charm. He held power over people not through kindness but through secrets, the sort of secrets that one collects when one lives long enough in a village and asks the wrong sorts of questions. She nodded at Beatrice, who sat very still. Years ago, during the war, a young Beatrice, lonely, idealistic, fell in love with Captain Lionel Linton. He returned her affections. But he was also engaged, or nearly so, to Eugenia Weatherby. Prudence gasped softly, but Miss Marple carried on. He wrote Beatrice a letter days before his final deployment. It spoke of breaking the engagement, of beginning anew. But the letter was never delivered to Eugenia. Instead, someone, we may never know precisely who, intercepted it. It vanished into silence. Beatrice's voice, when it came, was soft. I never knew what happened to it. I thought, perhaps he changed his mind. No, Miss Marple said gently. He meant every word. That letter was found, decades later, hidden behind a photograph in Eugenia's house, the same photograph that had hung for years in full view. I believe Eugenia discovered the letter only recently. Perhaps during spring cleaning. Perhaps by accident. She looked at the others. When she realized the truth, that Lionel had loved Beatrice, old wounds reopened. Wounds she had convinced herself were long healed. And yet, Eugenia did not destroy the letter. She left it hidden, folded but intact. I think she intended to confront Beatrice with it. Perhaps to forgive. Perhaps to accuse. Beatrice looked away, her throat tight with emotion. Miss Marple continued, her tone now darker. But Mr. Pomeroy had no such intentions. At some point, he too learned of the letter. He realized he could use it, or the knowledge of it, to blackmail Beatrice. Perhaps he demanded money. Perhaps he only threatened exposure. She looked to Alfred Penrose now. And then he found you, Alfred. A quiet young man with a vulnerable past. A mistake at your previous post, a forgery meant to be corrected, still haunting your reputation. He threatened to expose you too. But unlike Beatrice, you had no one to turn to. So you watched. You listened. You reported what you were told. Until the pressure became too much. Alfred's voice cracked. He laughed when I begged him to stop. Said people like me were born to be stepped on. Miss Marple nodded sadly. And so you planned. You added digitalis to his drink, disguised by the metal of his flask and his own boastful pride in it. You waited until the fête. And when he collapsed, you thought it was over. Beatrice looked at him now, stricken. But Eugenia, Miss Marple said, was clever. She saw something. Or suspected. Perhaps she recognized the symptoms. Perhaps she found a clue, something out of place. Or maybe she had simply grown too curious for her own good. Alfred whispered, she said she would go to the police. Said if I didn't confess, she'd make sure I was ruined. And so, Miss Marple said gently, you panicked. You returned to her house, through the garden, wearing gloves. You confronted her. Perhaps you didn't mean to kill her. Perhaps it was a struggle. But in the end, you silenced her. No one spoke for a long moment. Miss Marple went on. But what sealed it, Alfred, wasn't just the glove. Or the mirror. It was the mirror that made me understand how carefully you watched people. How you placed objects to check your sightlines, just as a restorer would when aligning a canvas. You moved Mr. Pomeroy's mirror to see into the sitting room from the hall. And afterward, you raised it again, just enough to pretend it had never been touched. But it had. And behind it, you left a mark. Alfred lowered his head. I never wanted anyone to die. Miss Marple folded her hands. That may be true. But you did more than kill. You covered. You lied. And in doing so, you allowed suspicion to fall on an innocent woman. Inspector Raxby cleared his throat. You've done more than we could have, Miss Marple. Oh, I doubt that, she said with a faint smile. I simply noticed what was already visible. She turned at last to Beatrice. You, my dear, were the thread between them. The motive for both. But you were never the weapon. I believe you've carried guilt long enough. It's time to let the truth do what forgiveness could not. Beatrice closed her eyes and gave the smallest of nods. That evening, the village fell into a quieter rhythm. The church bells rang for evensong. The birds settled on the hedgerows. Life in Little Skelton resumed, as it always did. Miss Marple sat by her window with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She sipped warm milk and watched the clouds drift over the moon. Evil, she knew, did not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it looked like fear. Sometimes like silence. Sometimes like a soft-spoken man with ink-stained hands and a talent for symmetry. But evil never hid from her for long. In the end, truth, like the needle in her basket, had a way of threading through even the thickest wool. And so, with the last of the case folded neatly behind her, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once again. The pattern was clear now. And peace, however briefly, had returned. Epilogue. The leaves in Little Skelton turned gold by the end of October, drifting gently onto garden paths and pooling like forgotten secrets at the foot of every fence. The village returned to its familiar rhythm, slow, polite, and slightly nosy, as if murder had been no more than a passing thunderstorm. Alfred Penrose was quietly taken away, his name barely whispered now except in lowered tones at the butcher's. The church organ stood silent for a few weeks, until a new young fellow from St. Mary Mead volunteered to take over. He played too quickly at first, but no one complained. It was enough that the hymns returned. Beatrice Linton left the village not long after the inquest. Some say she moved to Devon, to live by the sea. Others believed she left to forget. But Miss Marple knew better. Beatrice was not forgetting, she was finally laying something to rest. As for Miss Marple herself, she returned to her garden, her needlework, and her quiet cups of tea by the window. There were still village fetes to attend, sermons to half listen to, and human nature to quietly unravel from a safe distance. And though no one dared say it aloud, many in Little Skelton slept easier knowing she was just a short journey away, watching, remembering, and always, always understanding. Because evil, like ivy, might return in spring. But Miss Marple, like the rose bush beside her door, would be ready,